Before exploring the role of cardio for fat loss, we first need to recap the basics of how fat loss occurs. Well, essentially there are two requirements for the best fat loss results. First is that we need to eat in a calorie deficit. This means that we will lose body weight over time. Ideally, this deficit should be relatively small to moderate to lose weight at a slightly slower rate. A slower rate of weight loss will help us with our second requirement for fat loss, which is muscle retention. Muscle retention refers to maintaining our muscle tissue during this weight loss period. This is so that the tissue that is lost during the calorie deficit comes from fat, not muscle. This is achieved mainly by continuing to perform resistance training, which provides the stimulus for muscle retention, or potentially resulting in some slight muscle growth during the process. So, what is the role of cardio in this equation? Well, cardio can help with the first requirement for fat loss, which is eating in a calorie deficit. Cardio can help us burn more energy, putting us in a greater negative energy balance. So really, the role of cardio for fat loss is simply to assist the diet by expending energy. However, it is also worth mentioning what the role of cardio is not. In the context of fat loss, the goal of cardio is not the following. First is that the goal for cardio is not to improve endurance for sports performance. You may slightly improve your endurance as a byproduct of cardio for fat loss, but the goal is not to set any running or cycling records. This is because the goal is not to compete in sport, it is simply a means to help increase energy expenditure. Furthermore, training for endurance performance may have some downsides, which we will cover later in this video. Second is that cardio shouldn't be seen as a method which can be used in place of eating less food. As we will discuss shortly, cardio is probably not as effective for burning calories as we may think. While it is possible, it probably isn't the best idea to rely too much on cardio to put you in a calorie deficit. This will be better achieved with manipulations to the diet. Now that we understand what the role of cardio is for fat loss and what it is not, let's now explore how effective cardio is for energy expenditure. To understand this, let's look at how we expend energy throughout the day via different components. While the exact percentages may differ slightly between sources, the general consensus is that energy expenditure occurs as a result of the following. The first and primary component of energy expenditure is our resting metabolic rate. This refers to the amount of energy we burn just by being alive and functioning. This is a result of essential bodily functions like breathing, the heart beating, brain function, digestion, and any other essential bodily functions. This is usually reported to account for around 70% of total daily energy expenditure in the average person who doesn't exercise that much. Next, we have the thermic effect of food. When we eat, we expend a little bit more energy to break down, digest, and store food. Most sources report that the thermic effect of food tends to account for around 10% of total daily energy expenditure for the average person. And the last component of energy expenditure is movement and exercise. This is the energy required for any form of movement we do throughout the day, from subconscious fidgeting to intentional training in the gym. This is usually reported to account for around 20% of energy expenditure in fairly sedentary people, but this number could be significantly greater in very active people. Furthermore, movement and exercise is usually broken down into two subcategories, NEAT and exercise. NEAT stands for non-exercise activity thermogenesis, which is just a technical term for movement that isn't formal or intentional. This could be movements such as walking to another room in your home, head movements, picking things up and putting them down, and any other form of consequential movement of daily living. And the other component is intentional exercise. This is any form of movement that occurs as a result of formal or planned exercise, such as sport, dedicated cardio, resistance training in the gym, or any other forms of intentional exercise. So this collective category of movement and exercise is where cardio can play a role. We can do more general physical activity, which will help expend more energy throughout the day, helping us to stay in a calorie deficit. Whether you want to classify cardio as intentional exercise or NEAT doesn't really matter, because the goal is simply to contribute to total daily energy expenditure. So how much energy does cardio actually burn? Well, there are many tables which provide general figures regarding how much energy we burn during various tasks. For example, this table taken from a research paper shows how much energy is burnt during various different tasks. If we are resting, we would expend approximately 1 to 2 calories per minute on average. If we perform very light exercise like slow walking or cycling, we will expend around 2 to 4 times this amount. Moderate intensity exercise like brisk walking and cycling expends around 4.5 up to 9 times the amount of energy compared with being sedentary, and more intense cardio methods like jogging, running, and sport expend around 7.5 up to 15 times the energy compared with resting. So in a single bout, cardio training does tend to burn quite a lot of energy per minute. However, in the context of the entire day, this probably doesn't have as much of an impact on overall energy expenditure as we may believe. This is because most of the day is spent not exercising, but energy is still being burnt. Let's take some of these figures and use them in an example. As our baseline, let's say a person was quite sedentary and expended 1.5 calories per minute throughout the entire day. This would equal a total of 2,160 calories over a 24-hour period. Now, let's say we take the same person and have them perform 45 minutes of fast walking per day, which is around 7 calories per minute according to the previous paper. This would burn around 315 calories for the cardio session. Then, for the rest of the 23.25 hours making up the rest of the day, let's assume they are sedentary and only expend 1.5 calories per minute. This would result in about 2,093 calories burnt. So if we replace 45 sedentary minutes with 45 minutes of fast walking, we end up with a total of around 2,408 calories. So this is about a 250 calorie increase in total daily energy expenditure from the cardio. This is certainly a significant amount of additional calories burnt, but not something that is going to have a huge immediate impact. It is very easy to eat an additional 250 calories, but it takes much more effort to burn this off. So while cardio methods are able to promote greater energy expenditure, they simply take much more effort to promote a calorie deficit compared with manipulating our diet. So once again, it should be reiterated that cardio should supplement the diet and shouldn't be used as the primary form of inducing a calorie deficit. Furthermore, cardio may be even less effective when we consider energy compensation. When we exercise, we actually have mechanisms that try to conserve energy. This is most likely an evolutionary biological trait that helps us survive during periods of low access to food. Essentially, the more exercise we do, the more the body attempts to conserve energy. This was termed the constrained energy expenditure model in this study from Herman Ponce and colleagues. The authors propose that based on how much physical activity we perform, it may contribute to energy expenditure in an additive or constrained model. If we are quite sedentary, meaning we don't do any or very little exercise, physical activity tends to have an additive effect on total daily energy expenditure. This means when we exercise, we burn more calories, and there is no or very little compensation from the other components of energy expenditure. However, if we are already highly active, then additional exercise doesn't seem to burn as much energy as we would expect. This is because the other components of energy expenditure compensate to conserve energy. We see decreases in resting metabolic rate and decreases in NEAT via less subconscious movements such as fidgeting, arm movements, non-essential walking, etc. So with very high amounts of cardio, it is probably not burning as much energy as you would expect based on the general figures. So at some point, more cardio probably isn't doing all that much for energy expenditure relative to the effort you are putting in. Rather, it may just be better to cap your cardio at a moderately high level and stay within a more conservative deficit as opposed to a more aggressive deficit. Now that we understand the effectiveness of cardio for fat loss, another consideration to help us determine which cardio methods are best is EPOC. This stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. This is the time period after exercise where we are still burning more energy than baseline, sometimes for multiple hours post-exercise. This is because our heart rate and breathing rate remain elevated after exercise. We don't just immediately return to resting levels. In the context of fat loss, this is a good thing because it contributes to our total daily energy expenditure. The duration and magnitude of EPOC experienced is dependent on the intensity of the cardio method. Generally, high-intensity forms of cardio results in more and longer-lasting EPOC, while lower-intensity cardio induces less EPOC. This was seen in this study, which explored the magnitude of EPOC between interval versus continuous cardio. On separate occasions, subjects performed sprint interval training, high-intensity interval training, or continuous cycling for around 20 to 30 minutes each. Sprint intervals included 6 max effort 30-second sprints with 4 minutes active recovery at 60% of max heart rate between sprints. High-intensity interval training consisted of 4 bouts of 4-minute intervals at 95% of their max heart rate, with 3 minutes active recovery at 60% max heart rate. And the continuous training consisted of 30 minutes of steady-state cycling at 80% max heart rate. In the following 3 hours after each exercise bout, subjects were seated and EPOC was assessed. During the actual exercise, the continuous cardio burned the most energy, with the sprint intervals burning the least energy. However, during the post-exercise period, the sprint interval training resulted in the greatest energy expenditure, about 50 calories more than the continuous training. But overall net energy expenditure was still highest in the continuous group. So while EPOC can help us expend slightly more energy at rest after cardio, it probably doesn't contribute a whole lot to total daily energy expenditure. Furthermore, to achieve greater energy expenditure from EPOC, we need to perform high-intensity forms of cardio, which may not result in more total energy expenditure when looking at the overall cardio session as a whole. Furthermore, high-intensity forms of cardio tend to be more fatiguing compared with low to moderate intensity forms of cardio. Let's now discuss how cardio influences fatigue and how this influences which type of cardio we implement. Essentially, we want to minimize the fatigue induced by our cardio training so that it doesn't interfere with our resistance training and so that it helps us adhere to the cardio protocol. Fatigue is multifactorial, so let's discuss each relevant component individually. First, let's cover the psychological fatigue of cardio. This refers to the motivation and willpower it takes to do the exercise. Quite simply, we don't want our cardio to be psychologically taxing, as this will take up mental effort that could otherwise be dedicated to resistance training. If you have to build up the motivation to perform each cardio session, then this may start to become another stressor in your day. Instead, we probably want to spend as little mental energy on our cardio training so that it is conducive with our resistance training and the rest of our daily life. Next, let's discuss systemic fatigue. This refers to global fatigue of the entire body, which is non-specific to that form of exercise. Symptoms of excessive systemic fatigue include elevated fatigue and lethargy, a lack of motivation to train, poor sleep, and reduced performance. For this type of fatigue, hard cardio training appears to be even more fatiguing than resistance training. According to this research review, overtraining syndrome, the term used to describe chronically excessive systemic fatigue, is most prevalent in endurance sports, not resistance training. This is likely because these forms of training require very high volumes at relatively high intensities and are performed very frequently. While I don't expect recreational trainees to be performing the amounts of training that elite endurance athletes perform, it should just be noted that cardio can have a significant impact on systemic fatigue. Therefore, we probably want to avoid performing excessive hard and long cardio sessions too frequently to minimize the systemic fatigue cost. And the last form of fatigue to be aware of when implementing cardio is joint stress. This refers to pain and irritation of the joints and connective tissue involved in the exercise. Obviously, we want to minimize joint stress so that we aren't developing any pain or injuries. While cardio is usually quite joint-friendly, certain modalities can be somewhat stressful on specific joints. Any forms of cardio which involve high forces, such as sprinting, are probably going to be somewhat stressful if performed too frequently. And clearly, this can have a negative impact on resistance training as well as general day-to-day activities. So with all this being said, how do we select low fatigue cardio methods? Well, there are two primary factors that will influence fatigue: intensity and the type of cardio implemented. In terms of intensity, low to moderate intensity cardio is generally going to induce less overall fatigue, while high intensity cardio is going to be more fatiguing for each of these categories. And in terms of the type of cardio implemented, we probably want to preference exercises with lower force requirements. This includes exercises like walking or low intensity rowing, rather than sprint intervals or high resistance cycling. And the last primary consideration regarding cardio for fat loss is the enjoyment factor. It is important to somewhat enjoy, or at least not despise, the cardio that you are doing. This is so that it can be a sustainable approach to implement over time. Even if you reach your fat loss goals, it is probably a good idea to implement some form of cardio into your weekly schedule just to maintain a higher average energy expenditure. This will help you maintain a lower body fat and is probably just a good idea for overall health. So for these reasons, we probably want to think of cardio as something we can do basically all year round. Maybe we just tweak the amount based on what our current goals are. And so if we enjoy the cardio we implement, it will take much less motivation and willpower to complete it, allowing us to sustain these habits long term. And in some cases, the enjoyment factor may even take priority over other factors. For example, I can see a rationale for someone playing recreational or competitive sport as a form of cardio simply because they enjoy it. Although most sports are probably going to be more fatiguing and have a higher injury risk than low intensity forms of cardio, some people may simply enjoy it more and find it easier to stick with. And there is nothing wrong with this, as long as we understand the small trade-offs that we are making. Traditionally, cardio is thought of as a separate exercise session. It is seen as a specific task that is completed for a specific time, distance, or calorie target. However, like we have discussed throughout this video, energy expenditure is a 24-hour process. We are always burning energy via our metabolic rate, the thermic effect of food, and via unintentional NEAT throughout the day. So we aren't only burning calories within our short cardio session. In fact, we may not even need to implement dedicated cardio sessions if we accumulate enough physical activity throughout the day. The way we can measure this is via our daily number of steps. This gives us a running track of how much physical activity we perform each day. So based on how active you are, you may determine how much additional cardio you may or may not need to implement. As a general guide, a low physical activity level would be less than around 5,000 steps. A moderate activity level is around 5 to 10,000 steps. A high activity level is around 10 to 15,000 steps, and more than 15,000 would be considered very high. So I think it is most accurate to use cardio as a top-up, so to speak, based on our habitual activity levels. Someone who naturally accumulates over 10,000 steps per day may not need to implement any dedicated cardio sessions since they are already burning a significant amount of energy from their everyday lives. However, someone who only accumulates around 4,000 steps per day may want to implement more dedicated cardio sessions to increase their energy expenditure. Furthermore, if you implement walking or jogging as a form of cardio, this will contribute to your total daily step count. This can allow you to set step targets to reach, which can be achieved via a combination of both everyday tasks and intentional cardio. Taking all of this information into consideration, let's establish some practical recommendations. Firstly, we should understand that in the context of fat loss, cardio is simply a means to increase energy expenditure. However, a single bout of cardio probably doesn't have a major contribution to overall daily energy expenditure. Furthermore, the effects of cardio may be further inhibited by energy compensation mechanisms. Therefore, trainees should make sure not to try and use cardio to compensate for a poor diet. The diet should be the priority. In terms of actual cardio modalities, the most sensible forms are probably going to be low-intensity methods, which have a low psychological fatigue cost, systemic fatigue cost, and low joint stress. Some examples of these include walking or light jogging, submaximal cycling, and submaximal rowing. However, trainees may preference more fatiguing forms of cardio if they simply enjoy them more, which is also completely fine. And lastly, it may be helpful for trainees to get an idea of their total daily activity levels, not just the energy burned in a single cardio session. The most convenient way to do this is to track your total daily step count. Intentional cardio can then be used to bump up our activity levels based on our step count. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.